Hello to anyone watching this. So as the Switch 2 continues to hurtle towards release, it's fun to start thinking about what sort of iterative generational sequels we'll be seeing. And the most interesting one I find to talk about is definitely the next Mario Kart game. And while it's fun to speculate on what the new characters, tracks or items could be, I definitely think the most interesting thing to talk about at this point is what the game's retro track selection is going to look like. So today I just wanted to make up my own potential retro track list for Mario Kart 9 and sort of list out the rules that I think they may use and the gimmick that may be included in the next game and how that could be weaved into these tracks. So the first thing I want to go over is just how many retro tracks I think there'll be. Now obviously there's every chance that there'll just be 32 base game tracks again or 48, but I'm personally hoping that we'll get 50 base game tracks, 10 cups with 5 tracks each, meaning 25 total retro tracks. I just think it's a nice total number to have, you know, it puts it a couple above Mario Kart 8 Deluxe's base game, and 50 in general is just a really nice round number that if they wanted to make DLC packs for the game, they can easily come with 2 cups with 10 tracks total, you know? I just think it helps round out the track list a lot more in a very almost contrived way, but a satisfying way nonetheless. And obviously none of this is to say that whipping up 50 different tracks is an easy task. Like, we don't know how much development time this game is going to get, but I just feel like having the total number of tracks rounded up like this will make a really appealing base game package, especially if the Switch 2 is backwards compatible and Mario Kart 8 Deluxe with the Booster Course Pass is right there. Next I'm going to go over which tracks I did and didn't want to include. Basically I just tried to avoid everything that's appeared in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe apart from its Nitro tracks obviously. I did have to make one exception due to logistical errors and just not having enough good candidates from that game, so I sort of had to just shove in something from 8 Deluxe to fill it out. But you know, overall I do think that we need to step away from what was in 8 Deluxe at this point. You know, that's its own beast, and again, if the Switch 2 is backwards compatible, all of these tracks are still going to be playable on it, so unless there's something that could really shake them up, there's no point bringing them back again. But in terms of tracks that have already been retros in previous games, I think they're almost mandatory to bring back again at this point. Like, obviously I'm not humouring the idea that there's only going to be 16 retro tracks, but in that scenario where reasonably every single game is going to be represented with 2 tracks at most, apart from Wii, which will probably still somehow end up getting 4, it means that each game isn't going to get as much representation as it could. So if you bring back retros that have already appeared before, that almost pads out the representation from those games. Like, especially with DS and Wii, where those were my first 2 games, I associate the retro tracks from there just as much as the Nitro tracks from that game. You know, they are a part of those games' identities, so I think bringing them back will help improve the representation of every single game. Plus it has been a really long time since some of these tracks have been remade. Like, Mario Kart 7 was 13 years ago. Like, the gap between Super Circuit and 7 is shorter than the gap between 7 and now, you know? I just think it makes total sense to start remaking tracks because it's genuinely been so long since they've been remade. There are probably a million new ideas they can cram into them if they get the full glow-up treatment. And if I've not made it obvious enough, I'm not including Tour in this timescale. Like, it's not a mainline game. Its retro tracks, more often than not, didn't do much to improve, and the ones that did get improved pretty much all got added to the Booster Course Pass anyway, so it's just not really worth factoring in. In terms of the total number of tracks from each game, I've included 3 from each of the 8 mainline games, and I've thrown Tor a bone and given it that 25th slot. You know, it's quite easy to guess if you're in the know about what that one Tor track is going to be, but I'll keep it a surprise for now. And alongside that certain little Tor tracks, I have included as many first time retros as I could, mainly because I want this game to still have its own identity with its first time retro picks. And obviously with the 3DS and Wii U choices, those can only possibly be first time retro picks, so there's plenty of new here alongside old. And finally, before I start, I want to go over what I think this game's gimmick could be, which is sort of interesting to talk about at this point, because I feel like there's enough gimmicks for the course designs themselves that you really don't need any more at this point. Like, underwater, gliding and anti-gravity can make pretty much any course concept you want interesting enough. You know, you don't need anything else to add to the pile, so I think it's about time to sort of step back and introduce gimmicks that change up the track in a different way. And I think the best thing for this would be the Wonder Flower, which I'm going to say for the purposes of this, once you drive through the lap gate and the second or third lap, something about the course will change. And so obviously there's a lot of things to consider with that, like if the Wonder Flower is activated by the person in first place driving over the finish line, you know, it needs to be a gimmick that doesn't immediately bugger over the people at the back with something that just like chops the course in half and makes it disappear, you know. And also, if the Wonder Flower can be turned off, you still need to have a compelling enough group of courses that can hold their own without something to really shake them up. And you know, I like to hope that I've done that with this list. Like, the fact that I have picked out 25 courses does mean that there's a good couple of each different type of course in the list, but I try to keep it limited to 2 at most, or 3 if there's an extremely different one. So I just hope that this is a nice varied course list that anyone can look over and be like, please give us that, Nintendo, thank you. So getting into the actual list, I'm just going to go cup to cup. So obviously easier tracks at the front, harder tracks at the back. And I'm not going to organise each of these cups, I'm just going to go in chronological order because I'm really not good at organising these cups in a compelling way. You know, I can leave that to other people. I'm just here to list out what tracks I think would be nice and what Wonder Flower gimmick I think would shake them up. So starting with the Shell Cup, up first is Moo Moo Farm, which may be a bit similar to how Moo Moo Meadows was the first Shell Cup track in 8, but that was a really sweet pick and I'd love for that energy to be recaptured here. And it's just a really nice, simple, plain track to start with, you know. It would be nice if some of the inner fences were pulled in a bit to create some nice grass shortcuts to spice it up a bit, but other than that, I think it's just a really safe first pick. And the Wonder Flower gimmick that I would give it is just to have cows walk onto the road and be turned giant. So you basically just have to avoid their legs, Dino Jungle style, you know. Nice, simple first retro track gimmick. You know, even though I said there wasn't going to be much of an order to this, I do think Moo Moo Farm is a good first Shell Cup pick. Next we have our first circuit track pick with GCN Mario Circuit, which the only real change it needs to make it more compelling is just moving it from the Leaf Cup to the Shell Cup. Like, I think it's a much more appropriate track to have around here, you know, not much else needs changing. Maybe you could squeeze in a glider ramp somewhere, but I don't know, there's not really many places for that. And the Wonder Flower gimmick that I would give it is to have all of the grass grow extremely tall on the final lap, meaning that the chain chomps and piranha plants are harder to spot when they're going to attack, and you can have little patooies pop out the grass and walk along the track to just sort of spice it up, make it just ever so bit slightly harder to traverse. Next is the only Mario Kart 7 retro track that I managed to fit into this list with Luigi's Mansion, an always popular course. I don't think it needs that much improving from its 7 version. You know, it's always a good track to bring back. And the Wonderflower gimmick that I would give it is to have Rings of Boos and King Boo in brackets Luigi's Mansion off Mario Kart Tour appearing to just be hazards on the track, and they can sing along to the music to make it more compelling. You know, just again something that makes the track that bit more interesting to traverse on its final lap. You know, that's the sort of vibe I want these Shell Cup Wonderflower effects to have. Next is Shy Guy Bazaar, which can finally get a chance to shine here after seemingly being snubbed at every single possible opportunity with Mario Kart 8. You know, it's a very interesting and unique desert track apart from any other one in the series, and it just deserves to come back. You know, there's not really any space for an anti-gravity section in it, but the layout itself is compelling enough to not really need that much changing. And the Wonderflower gimmick that I would give it is that on lap 2, the time will suddenly change to day, causing the main market section specifically to fill out with Shy Guys, making it really hard to traverse and almost inevitable that you'll have to jump up and take the rooftop path instead. You know, it makes you sort of consider your options. You know, it's game design 101 or something. And on lap 3, the time will change back to night, and there'll be loads of banana peels and mushrooms left on the ground to make traversing the market space still more interesting than on lap 1. And lastly, we have Toad Harbour, one of those really fun courses that's just sort of destined to come back at the first possible opportunity. You know, not much needs changing, it's already fun enough. And the Wonderflower gimmick I would give it is a bit different to the others in this cup. I'd have it be where a load of ferries appear in the water in front of you, and you're sort of forced to jump onto them and follow them, like jumping from one to the next, until you're suddenly spat out at the uphill section and made to drive the rest of lap 3 backwards. I'm not really sure about the logistics of the ferry. It might not be the most intuitive section to drive, but just Toad Harbour is one of few tracks that can be driven backwards and forwards. You know, it's why it was a battle track in base 8. So I think taking advantage of that would be nice. It's just sort of figuring out the best way to actually make you do that might be a bit of a challenge. But for now, I'll just say chuck in ferries to jump between, and the rest will figure itself out. So moving on to the Banana Cup, we're starting with our first SNES track, Cooper Beach 1. You know, it's not the most exciting, and the main reason it's in the Banana Cup is due to how tricky it could be to make sure you stay on the sand, especially if you chuck in plenty of crabs and cheap to keep the water more hazardous and less enticing to just sort of drift in the middle of the whole time. I think it's got its merits being in the second cup. And the Wonderflower gimmick that I would give it would sort of add to that, where I just have the water turn into lava, like just forced you to jump between the islands extremely perilously, and maybe even have the Cheeps desperately hopping on the sand to keep away from it, and maybe introduce bone crabs waddling along the floor. You know, we love a Mario Kart exclusive character. So yeah, I think there's enough you can do to this track to make it interesting in a game like this. Just, you know, we're having 3 SNES tracks, you know, we've got to just have something here. Next is the quirky and different circuit track pick with GBA Luigi Circuit, which I've always found to be quite fun. It's just its layout inherently means that it has some forgettable parts to it, like all the turns start to blend together, but with the amount of gimmicks that are here by now, there's plenty of ways to make each turn more interesting than the last. And the Wonderflower gimmick I would give it is that the rainstorm turns into a lightning storm, causing randomized massive craters to appear, similar to Lakeside Park off tour, where you can trick off of them and they make the course more interesting. You know, you don't need much more to a Luigi Circuit remake than that. Next is Desert Hills, a track that I simply could not get behind in either of its previous versions. I've always found it to be a slog, even as a desert track defender. You know, especially the final couple of turns where you just can't cut them off the way that you want to. It's just, no, don't like it. So literally just making the final turns more open and maybe having an off-road glider ramp at the start of it would be all that I need to make this a palatable desert track. And the Wonderflower gimmick that I would give it is to have all of the pipes in the background turn into inchworm pipes, where they slide across the course in lap 2, and especially at the start with the Oasis, I'd have some of them dip into there and spray water onto the track for lap 3, making it a bit more slippy and slidey, you know, just varying up the track. Next is Woohoo Loop, one of the all-time greats. The only crossover track you can really justify bringing back at this point. You know, it ticks all the boxes for me to be here. And there's not even many changes I would suggest making to it. You know, maybe having a couple extra cars to take the difficulty up just a slight notch, but other than that, pretty much perfect already. The Wonderflower gimmick that I would suggest for it isn't the most E for everyone, but I'd tie it back into Wii Sports Resort because, you know, everyone loves Island Flyover, so why not have everyone's favourite part of Island Flyover? You know, we all love crashing the plane down and watching little me's parachute up, right? So just have a couple planes on the road, you know, blocking up traffic, really hard to navigate around, but once you do, it's like, oh, thank God I'm past that. You know, that might not be the most appropriate gimmick, so maybe I'd instead suggest something like changing it to night and having a festival or parade spring up on the third section. But something about planes being on the track, it just feels like it would add a nice layer to the track at least. So I'm not going to put all my chips behind that, but you know, I've suggested it now, so there's no turning back. And finally for this cup is Shy Guy Falls, another Wii U track that just makes sense to bring back. You know, not many changes needed, it was always great, just keep it as it is. And the Wonderflower gimmick I would give it is just having giant oars appear up from the ground. You know, you can give them a nice sparkly effect, especially in the downwards waterfall section. They'd make that a bit more interesting. And for the ones on the main road, you could have little Shy Guy miners appear around it and sort of chip away at them, you know, something like that to just keep the track more interesting. And maybe they could even sprout coins from the oars, making it more of a risk versus reward thing to go near them and get more coins. So now we're moving on to the Egg Cup, which I just think makes the most sense to just be plopped in the middle here. You know, the Shell Cup's always been the first, the Banana Cup second, the Leaf second to last, and the Lightning last. So having this one in the middle just makes the most sense to me in a really unexplainable way. But anyway, the first track I have is SNES Choco Island 2. It desperately needs redemption from DS. Like, I never thought it was the worst track to play on, but the mud physics in that game really didn't complement it, so toning them up here, it'll just make it a much more compelling track. And the Wonderflower gimmick that I would give it is to make the sun more glaring and melt down all the chocolate, making the entire track a slippy mud section for the final lap, which will be absolute hell, but you know, the fun Mario Kart kind of hell. Like, yay! Hazardous track design, woo! Next is GBA Bowser Castle 3, which I've always enjoyed playing on it. I've just never enjoyed its setting. Like, the dark and gloomy nature of it just never really clicked with me compared to the indoor, warm and cozy vibes of especially 1 and 2. But I'm going to take advantage of it here with its Wonderflower gimmick, where I'd have it start to rain on lap 2 and sort of wipe away all of the lava, similar to the Beach Kingdom in Mario Odyssey, where you could just wash away a top layer of lava, revealing water, and then have the water slowly rise due to the rain. And so by lap 3 it's just a pure underwater course. You know, I think that would keep it way more interesting, and it's something about the track just feels like it'd work as an underwater track, but that might just be me. Next is Toad's Factory, which I'm admittedly not the absolute biggest fan of, but that's mainly due to the fact that it's a mushroom cup course. Like, it's way too difficult to be there. So just plonk it in the middle here, it makes a lot more sense. And there's not even that many changes that I could suggest for it. Like, maybe adding a glider section going into the conveyor belt part and leading out of the factory, but there are quite compelling obstacles on the floor there. Like, I'm not even sure I'd want those to be glider sections, so maybe you could just bring the course back as it is and it'd be perfect. The Wonder Flower gimmick that I would give it is to have the machinery constantly change between going way faster and way slower. Like, I thought that was the best use of time changing as a Wonder effect in Wonder, so to bring it back here, it just makes the most sense. Next is Wario's Shipyard, one of those tracks that's escaped being legally designated as underrated to the point that having it be here will just make it feel like its peak, you know, it's finally reached the top of its relevance. And there's not even many changes again that I would make to it. Maybe make some of the alternate paths in the opening section anti-gravity, sort of similar to Thwomp Ruins, but apart from that, not much needs changing. And the Wonder effect that I would give it is to drain all of the water only on lap 2 to make it play a bit differently, and then you'll have all the different fish bones just piling up in the middle of the track. You know, it'll keep it varied and then refill it on lap 3 to make it more normal again. You know, I think something like that is what will benefit this course the most. And finally, we have Piranha Plant Pipeline. What a surprise! I still don't know why this wasn't in the Booster Course Pass, and I still choose to believe that Daisy Circuit took its slot, so I'm still bitter about all of that, but if it can come back here and have a good proper touch up of its mechanics and overall look, I think it'll be justified in the end. And the Wonder Flower effect I would give it is to turn all of the pipes that you drive in into inchworm pipes, making them constantly move and change on the final lap to be more different to drive on. Like, a turn will suddenly appear instead of being a straightaway, you know, something that properly keeps your eyes on the road. I think that's the best for this. If I had to make a really radical change, I would sort of prefer if this was a section track. Like, I thought that when I first saw the track that it would be section based, but no, it's just got a really long and drawn out split path, and I can't help but think it would be better if you went from the green pipe to the blue pipe, then the red pipe, then the yellow pipe, and then you're done. Now we're moving on to the Leaf Cup, starting with our final SNES track, Vanilla Lake 2, which, you know, I've even played the SNES version of this track, and I really just don't think it's a scorn on humanity. I think it's a perfectly serviceable ice track that you might want to make 5 laps instead of 3, because it is a bit short, even compared to the other SNES tracks I'm suggesting, but I just think that just chuck in a cute glider ramp somewhere, make all the little cuts in the road trickable, and it'll be a perfectly nice pick. And the Wonder Flower gimmick that I would give this is definitely the one that I'm most excited for if this was reality. You know, when I started thinking of this, this was sort of the first Wonder Flower effect that I thought of, and that's making a load of penguins appear in the background on lap 2 or 3 of 5 if we're doing that charge towards the track and jump onto it and slide towards the water in the middle like pushy penguins off Mario Party. And there's loads of different things you could do with that. You know, obviously the bullet-like penguins will be their own obstacles, but then you could have a massive horde like push down part of the track and force you to glide over it. You know, there's just so many different things they could do with just a load of little blue guys. You know, there's so many opportunities that I genuinely think would make this one of the most appreciated SNES tracks in the series. So if any retro pick that I suggest here does get into the game, I genuinely want it to be this one, as long as it has the Wonder Flower effect, obviously. Next is DK Jungle Parkway, which has always been more of a chill out course to me, you know, nothing too overwhelming. Just get on with it, get through it, have fun, all that, you know. It's always nice to have those sorts of tracks at this part of the game. And there's not many changes you can make. Obviously the big jump's going to become a glider section, that's obvious, but maybe the cave section could be anti-gravity where you go on the walls, but apart from that, nothing much needs to change. And the Wonder Flower gimmick I would give it is to have massive geysers appear out of the river, you know, maybe even pushing out the boat and making it land on the track, where obviously everyone will be fine, it won't be connected to any possible tragedy from real life. And the geysers could also throw out cheeps onto the road, which will especially catch you off guard in that one section near the bridge where you can still see the river. And you can also have the geysers completely destroy the bridge going into the cave and make that a little glider section. You know, there's a lot that can change up the track to make it more intense on its final lap. Next is Mushroom City, a track that I've always really wanted to try for myself. It looks right up my street with loads of cute little different paths and ways to traverse it. I just know I'll have a lot of fun with it, and there's not many changes you could do. Like, it would be nice to have the glider ramp trucks from 8 traffic tracks come back, but I don't know if there's many good places for that, especially because there's a lot of ceilinged parts to this track, so I'm not sure how well that would work, but even just having the surfboard cars would be plenty enough. And the Wonder Flower gimmick that I would give it is to turn the clock back just a few hours to a really gorgeous sunset, which would be rush hour, completely blocking up the track. I mean, you can only possibly weave through all of the stationary cars, so it might make it a bit tedious to get through if it's not done right, but as long as there's plenty enough paths to still go through, it'll still be just as much a fun challenge. Next is Delfino Square, a course that I've always liked and I think could definitely do with another remake here. Like, maybe you could turn the big bridge jump into a glider section, but changing a ramp from a normal trick to a glider ramp that frequently might be a bit off-putting. And maybe you could have that secret shortcut to the side where you jump towards the market over the river be a glider section, but that might make it a bit too easy compared to what it was before. But my main issue with this track has always been its atmosphere. Like, I've never thought that autumn really worked for it, so once again, hopefully the Wonder Flower gimmick can fix that, where it turns the track wintry, where the course gets all icy and slippery. You can have the river freeze over, making it easy to jump over to, or maybe make that a Wonder Flower Lap exclusive shortcut where you jump onto the river and then hop onto the boardwalk, you know? And also you can have little snowmen appear on the track. You can just turn this into a really nice wintry wonderland, which I think would be, you know, a nice bit of irony for Delfino Island. And lastly we have Grumble Volcano, my 8 retro bringback, which I just don't think got that much of a chance in 8, to be fair. There wasn't really that much they could do with it to make it compelling. Even if it did have an extra anti-gravity section, it's just inherently not the most fun track to me. But I really think with the Wonder Flower gimmick they could do a lot for it. Like, this is one of the few tracks that already pretty much had a Wonder Flower gimmick with all the track pieces falling away lap by lap, but I think this time to really spice it up, the Wonder Flower gimmick could be on lap 3 having all the sunken parts of land come back up with spike statues that throw out giant spike balls to the music on the final lap. You know, something that really makes it more interesting and more memorable, really. That's his biggest problem, memorability. Like, I probably didn't even need to mention this was an 8, because you probably would have been convinced this was a first time retro anyway. But moving on, we finally get to the Lightning Cup, starting with N64 Wario Stadium, which, considering that I wanted to include a mix of first time and second time retro tracks to represent each game, I'm just sort of stuck with this bastard. I have to put it somewhere, so it's ended up here. And I think its biggest problem is simply its length, so let's just make it a section track and put in some giant anti-gravity ramps on the big turns that just go over the rest of the track, so they don't really affect it in any way, so it can still keep most of the same layout, and I think it'll be a much better course for that. And the Wonderflower gimmick that I would give it is that on the second section, I'd just chuck in a load of Monty Moles, you know, maybe in cute like patterns and groups together to make really interesting mound patterns, and you could even have a giant one that takes up pretty much the entirety of the road, you know, stuff like that. Just make this the definitive Monty Mole hazard track. Next is Dry Ruins, another track that was specifically snubbed by Daisy Circuit for its slot in the Booster Course Pass, which is another shame, but again, if it can get plenty of compelling changes here, it'll all be worth it. You know, you can make the exit from the pyramid be a glider ramp, something like that, just a couple cute changes to keep it fresh. And the Wonderflower gimmick can have the Yoshi Sphinxes start moving, you know, slamming their paws into the track, throwing out spike balls. Just, it won't make the entire track different, but this is another one of those ones that already has something change about it every lap. So to have something change about the rest of the track, I think that's all it needs. Next is Cloud Top Cruise, which, similarly to my other Wii U picks, this track just feels inevitable to be a part of this list, but I do think it'll be worth it. You know, obviously, again, not many changes can be made, but not many need to be made, and the Wonderflower gimmick can just switch the biomes of this track. You know, you can have the calm outside bits be really stormy and intense, and have the otherwise stormy bit be really calm and have all of the boost pads exposed. So if this is on the final lap, it'll be a real mad dash to the finish in that regard. You know, I think that's all this track really needs to freshen itself up in this version. And now we're getting into the final two tracks, Bowser Castle and Rainbow Road, which obviously aren't in chronological order, but you know, there's no point not putting these two in cup order. So starting off, we have GCN Bowser Castle, which is definitely my favourite out of all the 3D Bowser Castles, so obviously I think it deserves to be brought back, and there's plenty of changes they could do to it, like turning the final jump into a glider section, you know, simple things like that. The Wonderflower gimmick that I would give it would be to make all of the obstacles slow down, but have an echo effect, because one of the most tricky parts of this track in the original is that stuff like the thwomps would spin you out even if you just drove into it. So I feel like that can be recaptured here if the slowed down obstacles have an echo effect where they still last way longer as hazards. You know, it keeps them more on the road for longer and harder to avoid, which is what you want from a Bowser Castle in the Lightning Cup. And finally, we have GBA Rainbow Road, the most obvious pick out of this entire video. You know, there's no point quarrelling, there's an extremely high chance we're going to get this either way, so let's just make it the best it can be. I'm not sure if they keep the bouncy rails on the edge. It really just depends on how free and open the next game's engine is to let you make really broken shortcuts out of them. They'll sort of dictate whether or not they're back, but one thing that I definitely like to see on this track are Mecha Koopas, because they're a really cute obstacle on GBA Bowser Castle 4, so it'd be cute if they were brought to the next track along from that list. Even if it doesn't make the most sense, I think it'd be cute. And I'd make them the laser spitting ones from Mario Maker, so on the first lap they'd obviously be spitting horizontally, diagonally, just being a little nuisance, bless them. But they definitely changed with the Wonderflower gimmick, which, since this is a flat floating course, I thought it would be nice if the entire track just started tilting on the second lap, you know, instantly becoming anti-gravity, making the second lap just that bit more exciting. And then by the third lap, the track will be completely upside down, which is fun enough on its own, but I'd have the Mecha Koopas be on the now underside of the road still. but still shooting up lasers, so they look like pillars coming out of the ground, and you'll be able to tell because the road will start like burning up. And I think that would just keep this track just really exciting, especially in the last lap. You know, it's what you want out of a Rainbow Road, just crazy space-bound gimmicks. So yeah, these are all of my choices. Like I said, I wanted to just try and keep the selection as fun and varied as I possibly could, and I like to hope I've succeeded. You know, obviously you're never going to get a track list that pleases everyone, but especially if they do have a Wonder Flower gimmick, I think that can brighten up literally any retro track list that they went with. Like, my god, imagine if Figure 8 Circuit had anything. But yeah, if you have any questions or concerns, do let me know. I was considering whether or not to do a load of retro battle tracks as well, but I couldn't think of many good Wonder Flower gimmicks for them, and I definitely wouldn't be able to get away with the one I thought of for N64 Skyscraper. But bye bye, have a nice day.